The question that Aristotle is considering in his Nicomachean Ethics is no small question. In fact, it's perhaps the biggest question any of us can ask. What is the goal or purpose or meaning of human life? Aristotle thinks there is an answer to this question, and he thinks that reason, through argumentation, through careful introspection, we can come to figure out what the wrong answers are to this question and what the right answer is. So I want to take you through what he's doing in Book 1. In setting up for this question, in laying aside various wrong answers to this question. Once again, he thinks that many people get this wrong about what the goal or purpose or meaning of human life is. And so his task is to try to instruct us as to why some of these answers are wrong and why his answer is the right one. So in this lecture, what I want to talk about is how he sets up the question at the beginning of Book 1, how he understands that question, and how he goes through various answers that people have given and why he finds all of them lacking. That's what I'd like to talk about in this one. So Aristotle begins Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics with the observation that every action and every deliberate choice aims at some good or end. Every time we consciously decide to do something, we have some good or goal in mind. He thinks that, in general, there are two types of ends or goods that our choices and actions aim at. There are various works or products that we can strive to achieve. And there are also various activities that we can aim to achieve. What's the difference here? Well, sometimes what we're after is some sort of product, something that is produced by the choice or the action. So, for example, maybe you're in it for the trophy. An example of something like this is if you choose to do the dishes, your goal is some end product, namely clean dishes. Or if you go to the dentist, your goal here is cleaner teeth or a fixed cavity. On the other hand, sometimes when we decide to do things, what we're aiming for is not some product, not some particular end result that we can hold and show other people. Sometimes the end or the goal is the activity itself. A great example of something like this is going fishing or hunting. Most of the time when I ask students who do go fishing and hunting, I ask them first whether they always get a fish if they go fishing or if they get an animal if they go hunting. And most of them freely admit that no, they don't get something every single time. Then I ask them about those times that they didn't get something. Do they think that those times in which they went fishing or hunting and didn't bring something home, do they think those are a waste of time? And most often they say no. And what that shows is that something like fishing or hunting is something you choose to do. It's an act you perform not for the sake of bringing home something, but for the activity itself. There's something about hunting or fishing that you just wanted to do. You wanted to get out there in the outdoors and to, be there with friends or family members and just sort of enjoy the activity. Notice that doing the dishes is not like this. If you were to do the dishes for an hour and at the end none of the dishes are any cleaner than what you started, you would think that you had not achieved your goal or your end. What that shows is doing the dishes is not an activity that we choose for its own sake. We choose it for the product that is produced. And nobody goes to the dentist just because they like the way it feels. Nobody goes to the dentist just because they like the activity of getting their teeth cleaned. What they want is clean teeth. If it turned out that after the dentist visit, your teeth weren't any cleaner than they were before, your cavity wasn't fixed, you'll think that you hadn't achieved your goal or end. So far all we have is the modest claim that every action and every deliberate choice that we make aims at some good or end, and there are two general types of ends or goods that we can aim at. There are works or products, and then there are activities. Aristotle also thinks that throughout the day, if you were to make a list of all the particular goals or ends that you were aiming for throughout your day, you'd come up with a really long list. So he thinks that we pursue all sorts of goods and ends that fall under those two general types of products or works and activities. But he also thinks that there's not just a large diversity of ends or goals that we pursue throughout the day, he also thinks that these goals or ends form a hierarchy. In other words, we pursue some goods or ends for the sake of others. When I ask students, when I do this in the classroom, why they came to class today, they chose, they acted so as to come to class this morning, and I asked them why. Maybe they think they wanted to do well on the quiz. So they chose to come to class for the sake of doing well on the quiz. And why do you want to do well on the quiz? So that I have a good grade in the course. Having a good grade in the course is the larger goal that you have in mind, and you notice that you do some things for the sake of that goal. If you could achieve that goal in some other ways, you might notice that, oh, okay, well, I don't need to do those specific goals or ends to start with. I just have to reach my ultimate goal. So every action and every deliberate choice aims at some good or end, and there are two types of ends, works or products and activities. And we pursue a wide diversity of goal or ends, but they also seem to form a hierarchy. We do some goods, or we pursue some goods or ends for the sake of others. But what Aristotle wants to consider next is, okay, if we do some things for the sake of others, if we pursue some goods or ends for the sake of others, is there some highest good or ultimate end that all of our actions are aimed toward? Or does it just go on forever? He provides something like an argument to think that there is some highest good or ultimate end of all of our actions. The argument that he gives is kind of in the form of a modus tollens. He says, well, if there were no best or highest good, and if we didn't take there to be some highest good or ultimate end of our actions, then we'd realize that our desires, that all of our actions are empty and pointless. If there's no end goal, if there's no point at which, right, you will have achieved what you set out for, if there's no end to doing things for the sake of other things, he thinks that we'd recognize that our actions are indeed ultimately pointless. He thinks that that would sap us, drive any motivation we have for getting out of bed in the morning. And so we can't really ever think that there isn't any ultimate good or highest good or ultimate end. So let's say that there is some highest good or ultimate end for human life. What would be such a thing? What is the thing for which you do everything else, and what is the thing that once you had it, you wouldn't need anything else further? Aristotle thinks that the basic answer to this question is quite simple, actually. He thinks most people would agree that what we're aiming for in all of our actions, and the one thing that we want such that if we had it, we wouldn't need anything further, is happiness. He thinks most people would agree that happiness is really what you're after. So if we return again to the student in the classroom, I ask, why did you come to class today? Because I wanted to do well in the quiz. Why did I want to do well in the quiz? Because I wanted to do well overall in the course. And why do you want to do well overall in the course? Because you want to do well overall in all of your courses. And why do you want to do that? Because you want to graduate with a good GPA. And why do you want to graduate with a good GPA? Because you want to get a job. And why do you want to get a job? Because you want to get money. And why do you want to get money? So that you have enough financial stability to be able to care for yourself and your family. And why do you want that kind of financial stability to care for yourself and your family? Because you think that having that sort of financial stability, being able to care for your family, will make you happy. And so really happiness is what you're after in the long run. Everything you do is aimed towards this goal. Sometimes it takes a few links in the chain to be ultimately get to the answer that happiness is what you're after. But Aristotle thinks that everyone, when pressed, will ultimately give something like that answer. Why do you do anything? Ultimately, it's because you want to be happy. You think that this will, in some way, eventually lead you to that ultimate goal. So Aristotle thinks that there is, then, a purpose or goal or meaning of human life. It's happiness. And it is the search for happiness that gives purpose and meaning to our lives. That's the easy answer. That's not the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. That's not even the end of Book 1. He establishes this very early on in Book 1. But the real question, he thinks, is once we've established this, once we've recognized that all people agree that happiness is what we're all after, the real question is figuring out what happiness is. As he says in section 4 of book 1, he says, everyone would agree that happiness is what we're after, but there'd be a lot of disagreement about what happiness is. Some people think that happiness it consists in pleasure, or at least the absence of pain, or turmoil, or the absence of suffering. Some people think that happiness consists in having a lot of wealth and financial stability. Some people think that happiness consists in honor, in being appreciated, and being loved. Some people think that there's no one single answer to the question, what is happiness? Maybe it's different for different people. Maybe it's different for you, even at different stages in your life. When you're a kid, maybe happiness is having $5 to spend at the candy store. Maybe when you got older, right, happiness was having a job that you loved. Maybe older still, right, happiness consists in these deep and meaningful relationships with other people. Maybe it changes as you mature. Maybe it's not even the same for different people. Maybe different people find happiness in different things. Surprisingly, Aristotle thinks that this is the wrong way to look at it. He thinks that not only is there an answer to the question, what is the goal, purpose, and meaning of life, and not only do he think it's happiness, he thinks that there is one single account of what happiness is. There is a best answer to the question, what is happiness? He thinks that there's an account of happiness that applies to every single one of us as human beings, and one that applies across our entire lives, which is already a bold conclusion to reach. I think many of us would think that, well, different things make different people happy, and so happiness is different for different people. What Aristotle wants to do in the Nicomachean Ethics is he wants to come up with the best answer to what is human happiness. What is happiness for human beings? He thinks this is a general account of happiness that applies to every single one of us, right? By virtue of the fact that we are human beings. And he thinks that other people have tried to spell out something like that, a general account of human happiness, right? I mean, look at even today, right? You go to any bookstore, there's probably a pretty large section of self-help books that are trying to get you, right, to help you to achieve happiness. But of course, if happiness was just different for each person, then reading what somebody else says wouldn't seem to help you at all. So we have to, on the one hand, we think that happiness might be different for different people. On the other hand, we think that there must be enough that's the same about us, similar between us, that we can start to think, right? We can reason our way to understanding what sort of things are most likely to bring about true and deep and complete happiness for us as human beings. So what Aristotle does next, so far he's just established that there is some goal or purpose or meaning of human life. There is a highest good or ultimate end, and this is happiness. What is happiness? He thinks that reason can help us figure out what the answer to this question is. And so what he does in section 5, which is a really important section of book 1, and the last section that I want to talk about in this video here, is he goes through various options for what happiness could be for human beings, options that people have offered, and indeed options that people have actually pursued in their lives. So not only have people said that this is what happiness is, but these are the most common ways that people actually live. This is the most common ways in which they live in order to achieve happiness. So if you take a look at section 5, hopefully you have your book with you, is he spells out what the different ways people live their lives are. He says, let us take up our account at the point where we digressed. People seem, which is not unreasonable, to get their suppositions about the good, that is happiness, from their lives. For ordinary people, the most vulgar ones suppose it to be pleasure, and that is why the life they like is the life of indulgence. For there are 3 lives that stand out, the one we just mentioned, the political, and third, the contemplative. So what Aristotle is suggesting here is that there are actually 3 main ways in which people live their lives in order to try to be happy. But as it turns out, there may be as many as 5 different lives that he considers in this section. He's given us the names of 3 of them so far. So he said that the 3 ways in which people live their lives, there's the life of indulgence, which takes pleasure to be the highest good. There's the political life, which he hasn't said very much about yet. And then there is the contemplative life, which is actually he's not going to say very much about in this section. But let's read what he says about each life Each life is going to have a name. So we got life of indulgence, political life, and the contemplative life. Each one is going to take something different to be the key to happiness. Each one is going to say that there is some different key ingredient to what happiness is. So the life of indulgence, we know, already takes pleasure to be the highest good. The idea is that you want to be happy, get as many good feelings as you can. Get as much of a internal sense of joy or satisfaction as you can, or at least the absence of pain or suffering, something like that. Key to happiness is feeling good from the inside. This is a common way that people live their lives in order to try to be happy, not just in Aristotle's time, but in our own. We tend to think that when we're feeling the most pleasure is when we are happiest. Aristotle thinks this is a dead end, though. Aristotle does not think that this is likely to bring us a full and meaningful happiness that, deep down, we desire. And why not? What's his argument here? So if we turn to the next paragraph, what he says. Now, ordinary people do seem wholly slavish because the life they deliberately choose is one that is characteristic of grazing cattle. They have an argument for their choice, though, because many of those in positions of authority feel the same as Sardanapalus. I don't know who Sardanapalus is, but take a look at that earlier sentence where he introduces his objection to the life of indulgence. Why does he think that a life in pursuit of pleasure is not likely to give us the full and deep and meaningful happiness that we desire? Well, he says that those who choose such a life are like grazing cattle. We might call this the grazing cattle objection to the life of indulgence. And on the outset, it looks like what Aristotle is giving is a sort of ad hominem, right? Those people who pursue pleasure, cows. But I think there's more to it. I think his objection here is much deeper than that. And I think the way to see how his objection is deeper than that is to remember the things that we talked about when we read some sections of his De Anima, or his work on the soul. In his work on the soul, we saw that Aristotle divided the living world into three categories. There are plants, there are non-human animals, and there are us, human beings. And the way that he delineates between these three categories of living things, he delineates them between them in two ways. We know that for Aristotle, anything that's alive has a soul. It doesn't mean it has an immortal soul, but it does mean that it has a form, that its matter is in a very complicated way so as to compose something that is alive. And that's all he means by it having a soul. But different kinds of living things have different kinds of souls, as we learned from his book, the De Anima. Plants have nutritive souls, which are the most basic kind of souls. Non-human animals have sentient souls. And human beings have rational souls, the most complicated kinds of souls that something can have. So the first way to distinguish between the three types of living things, according to Aristotle, is what sort of souls they have. He thinks principally the difference is going to be in the soul, less so about the matter. We're going to be composed of roughly the same kinds of stuff. It's just going to be a very different structure or configuration to that stuff that's going to produce the kind of living thing that we're dealing with. The other way to distinguish between the types of living things, according to Aristotle, is based on their capacities, based on their abilities, based on what those things can do. So, for example, living things, their characteristic abilities are the ability for self-nutrition, to bring in nutrients from the outside, growth, ability to grow, and indeed self-limited growth, as he identifies, right? It's not just growing indefinitely, but they have some sort of internal plan for how much they should grow and when they should stop. And also reproduction. Plants can reproduce more of the same. So those are the three major capacities that a plant has: self-nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Non-human animals have all of those same capacities as a plant does. It has the ability to bring in nutrients, to grow, and to reproduce. According to Aristotle, what makes a non-human animal different than a plant is its ability to perceive the world around it. And In other words, it has senses. Aristotle is actually responsible for introducing the list of the 5 senses that we sort of take for granted. Aristotle thinks that any animal is going to have at least one of the 5 senses. He thinks lots of animals have all 5 senses. He thinks that any animal is going to have at least one sense. And that's what's going to set it apart from a plant. Anything that has at least one of the senses counts as an animal on Aristotle's picture. He says, so any animal is going to have at least one sense, and he thinks the most basic sense is the sense of touch. He thinks that some creatures that don't have any of the other senses have at least the sense of touch. So you can imagine, right, I don't know, a clam. A clam has a very sort of basic perception of the world, based principally, let's say, on touch, it seems, right? Even though the clam can't see, can't hear, can't smell, the clam can experience the sense of touch. So, right, he interacts with his environment based on sort of basic sensations of touch. Gets whether it's he's sort of sensing through touch something that ought to be eaten or something that ought to be avoided. Now, what's interesting about the sense of touch is if you have the sense of touch, you also have a further capacity or a related capacity. That's the capacity to feel pleasure or pain. Pleasure or pain is most basically tied to our sense of touch. When you have the sense of touch, you can feel pain, and indeed you can feel pleasure in that respect as well. So what this means is that if any animal has at least the sense of touch, that means that any animal, by virtue of being an animal, also can feel pleasure or pain. So as I said, the clam can't see or hear or smell, but the clam can feel pain. If you poke the clam, don't poke the clam. But if you poke the clam, right, he's going to try to avoid that. He's going to feel some sort of sensation of pain, which is sort of a feeling of danger, something to be avoided. The other capacity that Aristotle says that animals often have is they often have the capacity for movement. He thinks in a way that plants do not. In some ways this seems right. So for example, if you take a chainsaw to an oak tree, it can't run out of the way. But if you take a chainsaw to a dog, don't take a chainsaw to a dog. But if you took a chainsaw to a dog, then it could run away. It has the capacity for movement in most cases. But even though movement is often associated with animals, he doesn't think that that's the one characteristic capacity of an animal. He still thinks that it has to do with sensation, and as we've seen, at least the sense of touch. So far we've got 3 categories of living things. We've got plants, which are capable of self-nutrition, growth, and reproduction. We've got non-human animals, which are capable of self-nutrition, growth, reproduction, and sensation, and often movement. Human beings, on the other hand, right, are capable of all the lower things, as he puts it, but also more. So human beings have the capacities for self-nutrition, growth, and reproduction, also a sensation and movement that makes them similar to non-human animals. But the further capacity that human beings have, that Aristotle thinks that no other creatures have, is our capacity for rationality, our capacity to reason, our capacity to understand in the sense outlined in Book 1 of his Metaphysics. We have the ability to form universal judgments, to consider things in the abstract in a way that other creatures do not. Well, why is all this relevant, and how does this come back to the grazing cattle objection? Well, here's, I think, what the connection is. What Aristotle is saying is that if you pursue a life dedicated to pleasure as the most important thing in your life, he says that is just as much a sort of life that could be pursued by a cow grazing in the field. And indeed, right, the life of pleasure in the absence of pain is the best sort of life that we can imagine for a cow in the pasture, right? You can imagine like what would be the best sort of life for the cow. You can imagine sort of a lush, rolling, green landscape, right, in the sunshine, maybe a body of water, right, from which to drink, right, maybe a different one to hop in, right, when it's really hot out. But the ideal life for the grazing cow is one dedicated to pleasures of various sorts and elimination of pain. And so what Aristotle is saying here about someone who lives a life of indulgence is that they're pursuing a life that other creatures, all animals, are also capable of pursuing. And I think the mistake that people make then is that they are failing to see that we as human beings are capable of more. He thinks that underlying here is that in order to really be happy, in order to find your happiness as a human being, you ought to be using your highest capacities. You ought to be living up to your full potential. Failing to live up to your full potential, failing to utilize your highest capacities, will undermine your happiness. It might seem like pleasure is making you happy for a while, but it is bound to be unsatisfying because deep down you realize that you are capable of more than just the good feelings. The analogy that I use for this in class, for those of you who are there, is something like, you can imagine like the best running back in the NFL, the one who's leading the league in rushing yards. And one day in the middle of the season, right, he's at the start of his prime. People think that he's going to lead the league in rushing for many years to come. He decides that he's giving up the game of football. He's not going to be playing anymore. And the reporters ask him, well, what are you going to do then? And he says, I'm going to go and wash high-rise windows. Well, that's a curious decision, but he says it's just really what I want to do. And so that's what he does. He's out there way up high on the high-rise buildings washing the windows, and he thinks, wow, this is what I wanted. I'm so glad to get away from that. And you might think that, okay, well, that's what he wanted to do. That's what makes him happy. That's what happiness is for him. But now think about as he hears about what's going on in the NFL since he left. He hears about who's leading the league in rushing, and he thinks to himself, oh, no, I could be definitely doing better than that guy. I was on pace to do way better than where that guy is right now. And so that might bother him a little bit, that he knows that he could be beating the guy who's currently leading the league in rushing. The other thing he'll think about is maybe his team is not doing well without him, right? Maybe they really relied on him while he was playing, while he was rushing for them. And so what he'll think about is, oh gosh, it pains me, right, to hear about my team doing so poorly. I could be really helping them, right? Maybe we even could have won a championship if I were helping them. And so what we think about is that this star running back would look back on what he was doing before, and even though what he wanted to do was to wash the high-rise buildings, you might think that to some extent he's going to be unsatisfied with that. Why? Because he knows that he's capable of more, that he has some special talents or abilities that he's not using. Lots of different people could wash high-rise windows, but only he could do, right, the sorts of things that he was doing on the football field, running really fast and dodging tackles. And so the fact that he knows this about himself is going to bother him. It's going to get in the way of him being truly happy while he's washing the high-rise windows. Aristotle thinks something similar will happen to us if we were to pursue a life of indulgence. He thinks that at first, yeah, maybe, that's what I wanted, right? Just the pleasures, the absence of pain. But he also thinks that eventually that will bother us. Why? Because we know that we're capable of more. We know that we also have minds that we could be developing, and developing to a much further extent than we are currently. And he thinks that this will bother us. This will get in the way of us being truly happy. And so I think this is all packed into his grazing cattle objection to the life of indulgence. What people who live a life of indulgence are doing is that they're living the best sort of life that would be possible for other creatures, but they aren't keeping in mind that we're capable of more. And insofar as we're capable of more, he thinks that we will be unsatisfied. We will not be truly happy if we don't utilize those capacities, if we just live a life of indulgence. So that's his critique there. What about the political life? Well, to return to his discussion again, what does he say about the political life? The sophisticated people, on the other hand, and doers of action, deliberately choose honor, since it is pretty much the end of the political life. So, the life of indulgence, the key to happiness is taken to be pleasure. Political life, the key to happiness is taken to be honor, or reputation, or esteem, being liked, being appreciated. It, however, is apparently more superficial than what we are looking for, since it seems to be in the hands of the honorers more than of the honorees, whereas we have a hunch that the good is something that properly belongs to us and is difficult to take away. So his first critique of the political life And here he calls it the political life, but it doesn't mean, right, that it's only the sort of life that people pursue when they engage in a life of politics, or it's not even the case that all who look for a career in politics are living the political life. All he means here, right, this is the political, the social life in which you take your happiness consist in being appreciated and being liked by others. Sort of the contemporary version of this life is something like the person who evaluates their life through their social media influence, right? Things are going well when they get likes and when they get shares and when people comment on their posts. And their life is not going well when people actually don't like their posts or aren't paying attention to them. This is all sort of the political life. It's not just limited to politics. Well, what's his objection to this life? Some people think that, well, yes, happiness consists in being liked and being respected and being appreciated by other people. Aristotle thinks this too is a dead end, though. What's his critique? Well, his first objection, he says, is that this sort of life is too superficial. He says it depends more on those who honor than on the one honored. What that means is that if you're living your life based on how other people react to what you're doing or how you are appreciated, he says that if that's where you put your happiness, that is going to be less about what you're doing, and it's going to be more about what other people are doing. He thinks that the problem with this is that you are placing your happiness in the hands of other people. You are placing your success or failure in terms of happiness out of your control. There's only so much you can do to make people like you. You could be doing exactly the same thing, and your reputation or people's perception of you can change radically. And so he thinks that if you were taking to be the key to happiness just honor, then you'd be saying that happiness is out of your control. It'd be out of your hands. But Aristotle says that we have a hunch, right? Or we have the perception that real, true, deep, meaningful happiness ought to be something a bit more stable than that. It ought to be something that is not taken away from us just when people think differently about us. It ought to be something more in our control. It ought to be more about something that we do rather than how people perceive us. That's his first objection. His second objection to the political life comes up next. He says, further, people seem to pursue honor in order to be convinced that they are good. At any rate, they seek to be honored by practically wise people, among people who know them, and for virtue. It is clear, then, that according to them, at least, virtue is better. So his second critique is, well, wait a second. Maybe some people really just want to be honored, to be respected, to be liked, to be appreciated. But he thinks that most people actually, it's not just about the honor or the appreciation or the respect. They don't just want to be honored or respected or appreciated for anything, and they don't want to be falsely appreciated. They don't want to get awards for things that they didn't actually do. They don't want to be honored for things that aren't actually honorable. So what he's suggesting here is what we really want. What we really want is to be respected, admired, honored for things that are actually true of us, things that we've actually done, for good qualities that we actually have. And so the suggestion here is really what a lot of people really want is not to be honored. Honor is not the key. They want to be honorable. They want to have the right sort of qualities, the right sort of virtues that make them the sort of person that can be rightfully honored. And so he shifts to a discussion of, right, a version of the political life, or maybe a different life altogether, according to which virtue, having good qualities, is the focus. And that's what he talks about next. He says, maybe one might even suppose that it is more the end of the political life than honor is. But even virtue, he says, is apparently too incomplete, since it seems possible to have virtue even while sleeping, or being inactive throughout life, or while suffering emails and bad luck of the worst sort. Someone who was living like that, however, no one would call happy unless he was defending a thesis at all costs. That is enough about these issues, since they have been adequately discussed in the works that are in circulation. So he considers then a kind of the political life, or maybe a slightly different life altogether, called the life of virtue, which takes the key to happiness to be having certain admirable or honorable qualities. Even though Aristotle's going to have all sorts of good things to say about virtue later on, and in fact he talks about virtue more than anything else in the Nicomachean Ethics, he makes a strange remark here that virtue by itself is not enough. It's not enough to just focus on having the good qualities. His objection here is something that we might call like the sleep objection, or if we wanted to make it more serious, sort of the coma objection. The idea is that, well, look, if we're just about having the good qualities that makes you happy, then consider, right, you get a whole bunch of good qualities, um, kindness, honesty, patience, hardworking, and then you immediately fall asleep for the rest of your life, or you fall into a deep coma for the rest of your life. There's a sense in which you'll still have those qualities. If someone could wake you up, you'd sort of immediately exhibit them. But we wouldn't want to say that someone who sleeps for the rest of their life, or someone who's in a coma for the rest of their life, is truly happy in the deepest sense. What Aristotle thinks this shows is that it isn't just about having good qualities. Right? There has to be something more. Otherwise, having them and just being asleep or in a coma would be the happiest sort of life. Clearly, it isn't. Clearly, we can envision a more happy life than that. So his idea is that having virtues wouldn't be enough. It must also involve something, some sort of activity, something that you do. It must involve not only having virtues, but acting on them. We'll hear more about this sort of active life of virtue in Book 2 and in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So far, he's dismissed roughly 3 kinds of life that people pursue. There's a life of indulgence, which takes pleasure to be the highest good. He raises the grazing cattle objection to this sort of life. He thinks this is a dead end. Even though some people might think it's making them happy, or people might think that it will make them happy, he thinks they're just wrong about that. The second one was the political life, where honor is the highest good. Here, he raises the superficiality objection. And he also raises the objection that, well, we don't want any false honors. We want to be honored for things that are actually true of us. So then he considers this other life, we might call like the life of passive virtue, the life of having good qualities, where having those good qualities is the key to happiness. He thinks this can't be the key either. It can't just be having the good qualities, otherwise the person who got them and fell asleep or in a coma would be the happiest. But that can't be right. So far he's identified 3 dead ends. What's he doing here is important to notice. He's not just saying that, well, whatever floats your boat. He's saying, no. None of these things will float your boat. It may seem like they're doing so, right? But they're not making you truly happy. Not in the deepest sense that you really desire. So what's left? Well, he considers 2 more in this section, actually. He says the third life is the contemplative one, which we shall undertake to investigate in what follows. And that's all he gives us of the contemplative life of Book 1. We don't know what this one is about. We're not even going to hear any more about the contemplative life all the way until Book 10. What about the next one? The life of a moneymaker is in a way forced, and wealth is clearly not the good we are looking for, since it is useful and for the sake of something else. Hence we might be more inclined to suppose that the things already mentioned are the end, since they are liked because of themselves. But they are apparently not the end either. Indeed, many arguments have been presented against them, so we may set them aside. So he's got the life of indulgence, which he thinks is the wrong answer. The political life, he thinks is the wrong answer. The life of passive virtue, which he thinks is the wrong answer. The contemplative life, which he holds on to, doesn't say anything more until Book 10. And then finally, there's what we might call the moneymaker's life, in which the key to happiness is taken to be money or wealth. Or sort of having stuff. He thinks that anyone who thinks that wealth or having stuff is the key to happiness has made a really key mistake as well. And his objection to this sort of life is that money itself is not an end in itself. Money is only good for what it can get you. Any good that comes from money is about what you can do with it, all the things that you can buy with it. So imagine you're stuck on a deserted island, and a suitcase full of $1 million falls on the beach. You might think, oh wow, $1 million. But on the other hand, it doesn't do you that much good. It requires an economy. It requires that people recognize it as being exchangeable for other goods. As I talked about in class, this is the sort of mistake that Scrooge McDuck makes, if you know Scrooge McDuck from DuckTales. He has this big vault of gold coins, and his favorite activity is to jump off the diving board and to swim in this big pool of money. He seems to enjoy that more than anything else. This is funny. We laugh at it. It's a cartoon because we recognize that he is mistaken the value of money. The value of money is not having it, not being able to swim in it, right? Money is only valuable for what it can get you further. But notice that what we were looking for is the ultimate end, the highest good. money can't be that, and so the life that's based on money can't be the happy life. Because money is only a means to an end. It's maybe a pretty good means to an end, but only a means to an end. So let me summarize then what we talked about in this video. The question that Aristotle is considering in the Nicomachean Ethics is the big question. What is the goal or purpose or meaning of human life? He thinks that there is an answer to this question, and he thinks that reason can help us to determine what the right answer is and what the wrong answers are. Because the Nicomachean Ethics is about ethics. It's about what sorts of things we should do, how we should live our lives. But he says the first thing you should focus on is what the ultimate goal is. That will help you orchestrate your life. It'll help you order your actions toward that end result. And so he thinks that we ought to try to figure out what the ultimate goal or the goal or purpose and meaning of human life is. He thinks the simple answer is that happiness is what we're all after. But we have a lot of disagreements about what happiness is. And here too, he thinks reason can help us figure out not only that happiness is the ultimate end, but what happiness is. He thinks that some people just get it wrong. People who live the life of indulgence get it wrong. People who live the political life get it wrong. People who live a life of passive virtue, moneymaker's life, they're all seeking dead ends. And he thinks that we can do better. He thinks that there ought to be a better answer to this question, something that gets around the objections that he's raised to these other sorts of lives. So what then is the right answer? If all these are dead ends, if all the people living these sorts of lives are not really happy, even though they might think they are, what is the key to human happiness? Is there really one single answer, and how would we go about figuring it out? That'll be the topic of the next video. That one is one which we'll see Aristotle present his famous, maybe infamous, function argument for what he thinks is roughly the answer to what is human happiness. So look for that one in a bit. Thanks very much.